So, hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Brookings India for a panel discussion on India and Indo-Pacific. We thought this is a timely moment to discuss a very popular concept. This is a panel which is born out of a partnership between Brookings India and Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, which is in the large majority on this panel. We're very lucky to have three of their fellows here, including the director, Dr. C.Raja. And we thought it's a good time to assess this concept, this very popular concept in the Pacific, and see where it's going, where it's taking us. On my side, just to get the thoughts flowing maybe here, I thought of just running you through three, I think, major challenges, because it's become very a popular concept. It's been around, what, more than 10 years now, or some 10 years. Everyone likes to use it. It's become widely used, I shall say abused in some ways. And I think it's important for us, I think, first of all, to define the concept. I was just thinking of concepts, and as a good political science student, the importance of concept is crucial, but they can also be, I think, very deceptive. Can we go to the presentation quickly? I have 3 slides. So the first one is just basically about defining this concept. I think Indo-Pacific has become a mantra in many ways. And the mantra, first of all, has a danger because this is an Italian political scientist, for those of you who studied political science, who alluded to the dangers of concepts. And the more we stretch them, in many ways they lose meaning and they become almost value-free. So I think it's very important for us to, first of all, define this mantra of Indo-Pacific. We've been using it in so many contexts, by so many different actors. I think it's high time that we also be very careful about what it means, unless the danger comes of becoming another ritual. Non-alignment in many ways performed this meaning, I think, for a long time. It's another mantra. Non-alignment means everything and nothing, is used and abused occasionally. I think the second one is implementing this mantra of the Indo-Pacific. I think words have great meaning, but unless they're followed with practice and action, they really lose their power. And it's extremely important to reassess to what extent this concept of the Indo-Pacific has been actually changing and shaping the behavior of several countries, including India. And the danger also of, I think, this concept being abused. I mean, just as a thought-provoking exercise, what if tomorrow China starts using the concept of the Indo-Pacific and saying this is also a Chinese concept and also defined in some ways Chinese foreign policy? And this is not so thought-provoking. If you look at what the Chinese are doing at the human rights levels at the United Nations, they've been using human rights now and saying we have a different definition of human rights. This is our definition. This is a very parallel, different definition of human rights. And I think finally, and this capacity issue is of course very important in the Indian context. I think India has in many ways promised the world to the world over the last recent years. And there's a lot of expectations in looking at in what ways can India actually act in the Indo-Pacific. And I think finally, I want to show you 2 other definitions of the Indo-Pacific which have come out recently, which speaks to the importance of balancing different concepts. This is Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor and actually a distinguished fellow here with us at Brookings India. He last week at a conference mentioned the Indo-Pacific as an ill-defined concept because it cedes the continental order to China and leaves only the maritime order to the rest of us, which doesn't serve India's purpose. Next slide, please. Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation, writing for the Valdai Forum, recently mentions that even as Delhi partners with Washington in the Indo-Pacific, their relationship breaks down in Eurasia due to key differences on the assessment of security dynamics in the region, especially in the context of India's cooperation with Iran and Moscow. Delhi's walking a very tight rope, fine balance between the political realities of Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific. So the last one is, I think, in many ways balancing various mantras, and we see that happening in Delhi as we go along these days. So let me pass the word to the first speaker here today, and we'll have 10 minutes for each speaker to revisit, reassess, and do whatever they want with this concept. Let me pass the word to Dr. C.Raja. He's a director, as I mentioned, of ISIS. You last one, sorry, so Dhruva. We'll start with Dhruva, who's giving us the other big picture. Dhruva is a fellow here in foreign policy, also fellow Brookings in DC. He's a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute in Australia. His research examines India's role in the international system and the effects of global developments on India's politics, economics, and society, with a focus on India's relations with the US, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe. Dhruva was previously a transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. Dhruva, up to you.
Thanks, Tino, and thanks to the co-panelists from our partner organization. It's also very nice to see so many friends in the room on this subject, I notice amongst other people, High Commissioner of New Zealand, the Ambassador of Sweden to India, and several others. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today. I've been fortunate to have spent much of the last 2 years traveling around much of the Indo-Pacific, from Kuala Lumpur to Colombo, from Tokyo to Taipei, from Honolulu to Hanoi, Bombay to Bangkok, Perth to Pearl Harbor, and also to Port Blair. So I've really been zigzagging across the Indo-Pacific. And in my conversations in all of these places and many more, I've tried to synthesize in some ways what I see taking shape in this region. And maybe hopefully trying to answer some of the questions that Tino laid out for us at the beginning. And I'm going to try and do very quickly 4 things. So one is quickly depict the changing strategic realities of the Indo-Pacific, describe the evolution of the term very briefly, just so that we're all on the same page, describe briefly what India is doing, at least on the security side. I'll leave the economic sides to my co-panelists, and finally outline very briefly what I see as some of the challenges. So just to give a starting point, I think we forget that the Indo-Pacific has been contested in the past, and the not so, and the rather recent past as well. This is, again, don't take this too literally, this is meant to be conceptual, but this is just a little bit of what the Indo-Pacific looked like towards the end of the Cold War. And I've left out the South Pacific here. This is just the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean region. But as you can see, you had a network of U.S. allies, a hub and spoke model, U.S. presence in places like Diego Garcia and Bahrain. But also, I think we forget, we had a Soviet presence as well in places like Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, in Aden in the West Asia, and in other places, by the way, in the Indian Ocean as well. Move to the early 1990s, to the so-called unipolar moment where the US was ascendant, and things changed a little bit. We saw US withdrawal from the Philippines, we saw some assets moved around, but you did see a period of relative US dominance here, and this was also during the Taiwan Straits crisis and other issues that defined the security challenges in the 1990s. The big change, of course, has been China's arrival in the Indo-Pacific. And I do want to emphasize that what I've depicted, the little Chinese flags with a green border, are civilian facilities. The red one, notably Djibouti, is an overtly military facility. But we now see China playing a role in the Indo-Pacific in a manner that we've not seen before. But China's rise is not happening in a vacuum, and we see other middle powers also with various kinds of investments, both civilian and military, in the region. And whether it's Australia's presence in Christmas Island or the Cocos Keeling Islands, or for that matter at Butterworth in Malaysia, or Japanese presence in the region. We've seen Japan open its first overseas military facility in Djibouti, or for that matter, India as well. And again, you see different types of activity in this region. And you add to this picture France and the UK, and suddenly this starts to look very, very crowded. Again, this was meant to be illustrative, but I think it helps to put some of these points on a map to show the evolution of this region. Now, why has the Indo-Pacific come up? And I would posit there are 2 broad driving factors. One has been the inadequate evolution of the post-Cold War international order. While we have seen a strengthening of the governance of the global commons to some degree, we have global agreements, for example, on the law of the sea, on the Antarctic Treaty, on climate change, even if these are imperfect and sometimes not adequately enforced. We've seen the evolution of the economic order, either the growth, the expansion of the WTO, the transformation from the G7 to the G20, the AI parallel institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank emerge. But if you think about the international security order today and the institutions that define it, these are still largely informed by the Cold War. Whether it's the UN Security Council, whether it is NATO, whether it's the hub and spoke alliances that the US had in Asia and the Pacific. And so this, I think, is the first sort of challenge, an inadequate evolution of the security order. The second major driver is our concerns related to the manner of China's rise and behavior. And these, what I've outlined here on this slide, are just some of the things that I've heard from officials in many of the capitals in the region as to what the concerns are. And broadly, they're fourfold. One is a lack of transparency about behavior, including overseas. A second is non-market economic policies creating distortions, and this being exported in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, and resulting in things like unsustainable debt, national champions, and other distortionary outcomes. A third is territorial revisionism, whether it's island building in the South China Sea, road building in the disputed borderlands with India and Bhutan, or the extension of air defense identification zones into the East China Sea. And finally, the erosion of certain generally accepted norms, whether it's freedom of navigation and overflight, cybersecurity and internet governance, or nuclear non-proliferation. And so it's in this context that I think the Indo-Pacific seems to have emerged. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about how it caught on in strategic circles, and certainly it started being used in think tanks, including here in Delhi, starting about 10, 12 years ago. One good example of this is a book written by the man sitting next to me, Dr. C.Raja which came out in 2012, which actually was subtitled Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. But certainly there were several strategic thinkers in many countries that made contributions to this. But just focusing on the official rhetoric, I would say I go back to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's speech here in New Delhi in 2007, where he spoke about the Pacific and Indian Oceans bringing about a dynamic coupling of the seas and a broader Asia emerging. And almost a decade later, he elaborated upon the normative aspects of this region. That this should be a region of two oceans, the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and two continents, Asia and Africa, that value freedom, the rule of law, a market economy, freedom from force or coercion, and prosperity. For Australia, the Indo-Pacific was a very natural strategic term. And you started seeing it used in defense white papers, but also more recently in the 2017 Foreign Policy white paper. And so you see, for example, a greater emphasis, including Australia's security policies, of Indian Ocean focus, not just an eastward focus towards the Pacific. The US was in some ways a very belated entrant to this, starting in 2017, indeed actually starting with a joint statement made between Trump and Modi when Prime Minister Modi visited the United States, which actually described the two countries as democratic stalwarts in the Indo-Pacific. And we see that further elaborated in a series of documents and speeches, starting with Rex Tillerson's speech before he visited India, that was delivered in Washington, President Trump's speech in Da Nang in Vietnam, the national security strategy that came out in December of 2017, and then more recently the economic dimensions being elaborated in a speech by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And while in India, in fact, the term had entered the official strategic vocabulary in the previous government. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had in fact used it in a speech in Japan, the term Indo-Pacific. But the greatest elaboration of this was done by Prime Minister Modi this year at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June of 2018. And briefly, he spoke about the Indo-Pacific being a natural region with Southeast Asia at its center. He said the Indo-Pacific was, from India's point of view, not a strategy, that it should be free, open, and inclusive. And he also, again, outlined some of the normative aspects of it, that this should be a region based on the consent of all, not on the power of the few, that there should be respect for sovereignty, good governance, transparency, viability, and sustainability, particularly on connectivity projects. So very broadly, just to encapsulate all of this, what I see as a common understanding across countries when they use the term Indo-Pacific is broadly four issues. One, that the Indian and Pacific Oceans are a shared strategic space, that there is an emphasis on the maritime sphere, that it's critical for both security and commerce. But I do want to flag, I'm not sure that we should take it too literally and say that this comes somehow at the expense of continental dynamics. And we see this when the US highlights its engagement with Nepal as a successful example of its Indo-Pacific policy, as indeed the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Alice Wells, did recently. Or when Japan talks about the region as two oceans and two continents. Or indeed when India thinks about the North-South Transportation Corridor and its role in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The third thing it does is it elevates the Indian Ocean in the strategic calculus, and I think this is true again whether we're talking about Australia, whether we're talking about the US or any other country. But for India, the Indian Ocean is in fact central. The Pacific is the periphery. The Indian Ocean remains central to the Indo-Pacific. And finally, I think there's clearly an aspect when I spoke at the beginning about the drivers of this, that the inadequate security order and upholding norms are clearly, these have been poorly defined and have become more contested, hence the emphasis on a free and open and inclusive region. The third part of my presentation, what India is actually doing, particularly on the security side, and I'm just going to focus on that. I would like to, and this is something I'll elaborate on a paper that's coming out, will hopefully be coming out soon. One is that India's Act East policy really differs from its Look East policy, and in fact one of the articulations of that was done in this room, in fact, by Secretary East Preeti Saran last year, where she described the ways in which India's Act East policy differs from its prior Look East policy, particularly with respect to its scope, its objectives, and its priorities. And a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific defines both that scope and the objectives of India's Act East policy. As I see it, there are four broad elements to it now. One is securing the Indian Ocean. Two, integrating India with Southeast Asia, institutionally, economically, and militarily. Three, deepening strategic partnerships, including with the US, Japan, Australia, but also, I would say, other countries, including in Southeast Asia, and from India's point of view, including Russia, France, and others. And finally, managing relations with China, and we've seen some evidence of that recently. There's a lot on this next slide, but I put this here very deliberately, which is, if you want to know what exactly India is doing, and this is not, I'm not saying here what India should be doing, these are actually things India is doing in the Indo-Pacific, in the area of security. I think it adds up to quite a lot. And I'm just briefly, I'm not going to go into too much detail on all of this in the interest of time, but on its own, I would say there are three broad things on the left-hand column. One, improving maritime domain awareness. And we see this in whether it's the acquisition of new platforms, such as the P8I, the opening of a new fusion center, which will take place shortly here in just outside Delhi, to bring information from several different sources, whether it's a series of white shipping agreements being signed, or whether it's cooperation with other countries, including in the Indian Ocean island countries, on maritime domain awareness. The second is improving the operational reach of the Navy. And I think it's quite striking, in the last year and a half or so, India has signed or implemented or started to negotiate logistics agreements with the US, or logistics arrangements with the US, France, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, I haven't mentioned it there, but Oman, amongst other places. And this, once these are all finalized and implemented, will actually give the Indian Navy enormous access to a very large number of ports across the Indian Ocean littoral, and indeed in the Western Pacific as well. We also see the Navy adopting mission-based deployments, which is a development last year, which is quite significant. Third is improving maritime infrastructure. There's been a particular emphasis on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, including extending runways there and developing port facilities, also in other countries as well. Now, in partnership with others, there's another set of activities that India is doing, and that's improving strategic coordination. And this is why we see this growing network of bilateral 2+2 dialogues, trilaterals, and quadrilaterals, as well as staff talks involving all three services of the Indian armed services. A second area is improving interoperability, including in the form of exercises, but not just exercises. It's also, you see, for example, India now trying to improve its liaison partnership with the US Central Command, for example. And also capacity building. And for India, this is two-way. This has involved importing whether it's importing technology from countries that are more advanced and developed, but also providing assistance, whether it's in the form of training or whether it's in the form of technical support to countries like Vietnam and Myanmar. Finally, let me just quickly touch upon 4 challenges as I see it. One is an inherent contradiction between the economic order and the security order in the world. And here I've just shown a few countries and their economic relations with China. Every country, India included, faces choices both at the strategic level but also on a day-to-day policy basis about how to balance what are sometimes very competing imperatives. The second challenge, as I see it, is a resource constraint. India is not alone in having resource constraints. The US has resource constraints, even China has resource constraints. But certainly this is something to keep in mind, that India would like to, on paper it makes sense for India to do 100 things. In reality, it will only be able to do some of those things. And so this will remain a constant issue. The third challenge relates to both domestic and international politics. On the domestic front, it's about sensitizing, being able to talk about the challenges frankly and sensitizing the body politic more generally to some of the emerging strategic concerns. But on the international front, there's India, and not just India, but other countries as well, will struggle in dealing with using extant international institutions to achieve its objectives. So I think it's an open question as to whether an ASEAN-centered world is really well equipped in its current form to deal with some of the challenges that I've described. And finally, I think a wild card on all of this is technological change, which is today we're thinking about in some ways yesterday's conflicts or at best today's challenges. But in some ways we have to be thinking also about future challenges. And with the pace of technological change and the military applications now of many of these technologies, whether it's the Internet of Things, cyber physical systems, hypersonic missiles, robotic unmanned warfare, or indeed deep learning and artificial intelligence, this I think will become a major challenge for implementing an Indo-Pacific or realizing a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. So thank you for your time. I hope this has answered some of the questions that Tino raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruva. 3 quick questions. I think how much of this is new? A lot of it. I mean, the act on Indian side. How much of these projects have actually accelerated in recent years or not? In terms of, I mean, I can think of the Malabar exercises you mentioned, the Kaladan project, which has been around for a long time. So a lot of this is happening, but how much of it is new or more? Second, how much of this is inevitable? India is growing as an economy, so beyond Indo-Pacific, beyond China, etc. Naturally, India is growing and expanding its interests and its horizons. And as a corollary of these 2 questions, if we didn't have this concept of Indo-Pacific, we talked about this yesterday, if literally this code word Indo-Pacific did not exist and had not been around for 10 years, would have India done the same? That's a good counterfactual. And maybe even would have India done more? And would have India have now the capacity to do much more? Unlike the possibility of this code word actually hindering a lot of these relationships because it's seen as a balancing act, as a geostrategic attempt to contain China, and we see a lot of countries balancing and being quite concerned about this concept and therefore often opting not to cooperate too closely with India, fearing repercussions, and therefore, to what extent has the concept affected practice? That would be a question for you. So next would be Dr. Amitendra Palit. He's a senior research fellow and research lead at ISAS at the National University of Singapore. He's an economist specializing in international trade policies, regional economic developments, comparative economic studies, and political economy of public policies. Prior to joining ISAS, he was at the Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relations, ICRIR, here in Delhi. His current research includes a focus on economic and political implications of India's integration with the Asia-Pacific region. His most recent book, 2014, is on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China and India, Economic and Political Implications. Amitendra, over to you.
Generous introduction, Tino. So I'll kind of try to extend this conversation from where Dhruva left it off and highlighted a few points on it. When we look at this Indo-Pacific region, and let's not forget the fact that we till now don't have a very clear idea about what are the regional boundaries, the shape and the contours. But what we have roughly in mind is the fact that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the stretch that covers multiple continents Asia on one side, a bit of North America, then Africa, Europe. This is a region where the most prominent economic feature is heterogeneity. It's an enormously large region, very contrasting economic geographies. The world's largest and most populous economies exist with the poorest economies. And say, for example, if one goes purely in terms of standard parameters of classifying economies, then the high per capita developed economies like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and the US are found coexisting with large middle-income economies. Many of these are also typically referred to as the emerging market large developing economies: China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia. There's a group of fairly prominent small economies in the region. And if I could distinguish the small economies into two categories, the first is the small and rich. And the small and rich include Singapore, Mauritius, Hong Kong, Macau, very high per capita income economies. And there's another category which is small but not so rich, including the small and poor. So this would include Cambodia, Laos, Maldives, Sri Lanka. So all in all, it's got an enormous amount of economic heterogeneity in terms of the economic characters, the economic structures, the quality of the economic institutions, and obviously the capacity of these economies to take part in the development projects that are coming up in the region. And when I say development projects, I think it's good to bear in mind that well before the free and open Indo-Pacific was being articulated, there were other ambitious connectivity projects that were already proceeding in the region. The first of this was, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative led by China. There was the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor that was being proposed by India and Japan. There were other regional transboundary corridor projects. Now, I think it's important to note that from a regional perspective, and it doesn't matter what region we have on our minds, the regions in this context are broadly infrastructure deficient, purely as a region. Now, when we talk about infrastructure deficient regions, it's great to have new infrastructure coming up. But let's not forget the fact that this new infrastructure might not necessarily be a win-win outcome. The reason for that is very simple, that when one looks at the kind of economic geography that this region has and its heterogeneity, what it means is that countries have had different levels and experiences of economic integration, and they have had different capacities and abilities of infrastructure use. They differ in terms of the quality of logistics, in the quality of trade facilitation, in the cost of doing business that they have within their spheres, their ability to attract investment, and also the sophistication of their economic and financial institutions. So as a result of that, you see regional architectures having worked relatively well in some parts of the region, like say, for example, Southeast Asia, haven't actually worked at all in many other parts of the region, where there are instances of regional architecture not existing at all. So the long and short of it is that some regions are more capable of better trade and more robust trade. And clearly these are the regions, some of those are blocked out in blue out here: East Asia, Europe, Southeast Asia, North America. Not all of them as a region, but most of the countries from these regions are in a position to take much better advantage of the new infrastructure that would come up. They would have better ports, which would, in a sense, enable them to connect much more closely with the liner shipping networks. They have much better land connections. They have much better digital infrastructure, enabling them to take better examples and utilization of the modern digital trade facilitation architectures that would come up. And there are some other regions like South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, which are lagging behind in this respect. So it's important to bear in mind that at the end of the day, if these initial gaps are not corrected, connectivity can actually be an inequality enhancing project. It has that downside to itself. Now, on top of this, let's get the free and open Indo-Pacific. And there were two specific articulations of this that came out from the United States of America. The first was at the APEC meeting in Da Nang in Vietnam, 10th of November 2017. And then there was a separate statement that came out from the White House on 30th of July 2018. Quite clear in terms of the details. The first was more of a visualization in the sense of the United States articulating an Indo-Pacific dream, all play by the rules, and the ones who do are the best allies of the United States. Then also in that very same statement, and this was well before the trade war began, that the United States highlights the possibility of it entering into bilateral free trade agreements with any Indo-Pacific country. And finally, making it very clear that the Indo-Pacific agenda of the US will focus heavily on development efforts and infrastructure building efforts. When we move to July of this year, we find more concrete and specific suggestions. The first of it is a financial commitment, $113.5 million. Skeptics would say that this is just about 10% of what China has committed till now. China skeptics will say that not even 10% of what China has committed has actually flowed out. So we won't get into that number grade. But the areas that become prominent in terms of attention, digital connectivity, cybersecurity, energy security, sustainable development. The United States passed the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development, in short, BUILD Act, creating an US International Development Financing Agency. We have expressions very clearly mentioned in this statement talking about the partnerships that the OPIC intends to build with India, Mongolia, Japan, and Australia. So now the FOIP is there not just as a concept anymore, but a rather well articulated and focused template to look at. The point is, where is it all going? And this is where I think there are three questions that become important. The first, which is of course dominating a part of the narrative, is the FOIP essentially meant to be the US strategy for tackling China's control of strategic industries, the future strategic industries. Is it essentially made for that? That's a question. Let's not forget the fact that the United States moved out of a very major trade agreement, which it itself drafted in a very major way, and that's the TPP. The TPP has now come back and is about to become operational as the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The US is not into it. But the CPTPP, of course, gives a very different quality of market access within its members to the countries that are now belonging to it. And whether this Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, is actually a way of balancing for some of the preferential market access, which the US is now no more getting as a result of not being a member of the TPP. The third point, and this is important because there are experiences on ground, there are lessons to be learned that China's Belt and Road Initiative is suffering from serious legitimacy issues. And the legitimacy issues are essentially in terms of the strategic prices that the country, several countries are paying in terms of Chinese investments coming into them, and whether that, in some respect, is a problem that might start characterizing the free and open Indo-Pacific in future. The problem over here, I think, is that the legitimacy problem of the BRI could have been avoided to a certain extent. For that matter, all connectivity projects could have avoided it had they had an economic framework or a structure. BRI doesn't have an economic framework. Nobody actually knows what is the economic vision of a BRI, except for getting down to the fact that this is a great investment game where the Chinese state-owned enterprises are into a widespread value chain building activity from the bottom end to the top end, bringing the software and the hardware together. There's no other economic order or architecture in terms of what we know as economic orders that are coming in through the BRI. Now, this is where probably the question that becomes extremely important is it possible for the Indo-Pacific to obtain an economic framework? This is an enormous challenge. It's an enormous challenge given the economic heterogeneities that are existing. Well, the WTO has not been able to create a global economic order per se with a large number of acceptable results. It's remained at the bare minimum. The Indo-Pacific is even more complicated because there is a very strong security narrative with respect to the region. So when any kind of economic order is discussed with respect to the Indo-Pacific, the geopolitics cannot be detached from it. But there are some templates. There are some templates in terms of some economic order having come up in larger parts of the region. One of them is the CPTPP. The other is the RCEP, which actually the Regional Comprehensive and Economic Partnership, once concluded, will become the largest free trade agreement in the world, and it will in fact cover more than 50% of the total economy of the Indo-Pacific. In terms of population, in terms of markets, in terms of companies, in terms of maritime trade, in terms of cyber transactions. So that again is something which is an interesting template to look at, because that's the only free trade agreement other than the WTO which tries to take an inclusive character. It has the high per capita income economies into it, like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and it has the least developed countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar into it. So there is a degree of inclusivity which is into this agreement, might just work as a template. There's also this fairly large and big bilateral FTA that the EU and Japan are planning to commence on very soon. Again, that might be another template to look at, or it could be a mixture of various of these. It might be none of these as well. The bigger problem, and this is where the region can get an economic character if it can focus on it, is the question of institutions. Now, when we come to institutions, there are two issues. Let's, I think, start with the assumption that given the fact that there's going to be an extremely high emphasis on infrastructure financing, we are essentially looking at institutions which can play this role. So in this, there are two categories. The first are the existing development finance institutions, and we have a pretty large group on that. We have the AIIB, which has become active in the region. We have World Bank, we have Asian Development Bank, we even have the African Development Bank. Now the point is whether these development finance institutions as the Indo-Pacific region gains greater traction. Are they going to develop greater exposure and lending programs which are more specifically tuned to the needs of the Indo-Pacific, because all of them have very strong stakeholdership in the region? Or is it going to be a question of individual country financing institutions beginning to take the lead, like the US agency that has come up through the BUILD, like the Japanese development agencies, or even the Chinese development agencies? Are these going to become the more prominent institutional actors? Would one see something like the Chiang Mai debt swap arrangement beginning to take shape within the Indo-Pacific? This is actually quite a strong possibility, because there are countries which have done this bilaterally. India and Japan have just entered into one. There's a group of ASEAN plus 3 countries which have worked out a Chiang Mai currency swap initiative. In fact, something like this, once it becomes operational and gets to be known as an Indo-Pacific initiative, automatically starts giving the region an economic character. But there's a greater problem now that has suddenly come into the story, and that's the trade war. Now, it's not a question of whether the trade war is good or bad, but the fact of the matter is that the trade war is something which is antithetical to the concept of a regional order. It doesn't want to create a regional order. It becomes a bilateral turf issue, deviation from the regional order, focusing more on one-to-one binary economic and trade relationships. So in that kind of a scenario, the issue of converging to a regional order does not arise, because all regional orders, at the end of the day, all regional trade agreements, all free trade agreements have to actually flow from the WTO. They may be challenges to the WTO, but none of them can actually afford to be an adversary to the WTO, because otherwise these FTAs do not become operational. That's the WTO accommodation. WTO allows for free trade agreements to go and run as long as they're not inconsistent with the WTO program and they offer more market access over and above what the WTO does. So given the fact that the global trade rules themselves are now facing a very strong pushback, what can we expect from the Indo-Pacific in this regard in the context of the trade war. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitanu. I think it's very useful to get beyond the typical geostrategic security mantras you hear about Indo-Pacific, a practical economic perspective on the order. In many ways, I would question to what extent do we already have an Indo-Pacific order in place? We're just naming it Indo-Pacific, but in many ways, many of the norms, the institutions you laid out exist. The only issues there are collapsing, or they're facing alternatives, competition. So the question becomes not how to create this order, but how to sustain or reform it. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Next, I'll pass on the word to Dr. Rani Mullen, who's also a fellow at ISIS in NUS. She's an associate professor in government at the College of William and Mary in the United States, also a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research here across the street in Delhi, where she directs a very interesting research program on Indian development cooperation, and she's been tracking that over the last few years now. Dr. Mullen's research and teaching focuses on South Asian politics, particularly state building and democracy in India and Afghanistan. Her book in 2011 was on decentralization, local governance, and social well-being in India, also domestic perspective. Rani, looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I have put up an older, few years old, so it's not quite up-to-date slide, because I just realized when I came here that both the previous colleagues had put together quite a few PowerPoints. So you have a visual, but that's my only visual that I have. And I'll try and confine myself to 10 minutes so that we can have discussion also at the end. So my few points that I'd like to make is to situate Indian conception of how it engages in foreign aid and how that might have changed with regard to the Indo-Pacific. Indian aid is, of course, not new. India already gave aid a couple of years after attaining independence in 1940, at the end of 48, beginning of 49. And since 1964, so over 50 years, India has had what is known as ITEC, the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. So India's engagement with what we are now terming the Indo-Pacific actually predates this discussion of an Indo-Pacific, particularly as it relates to the Indian Ocean part of that concept that we're talking about. Indian ITEC program beneficiaries have included since the 60s countries on the eastern part of Africa, from Ethiopia and Kenya to South Africa. But what we have seen when we look at Indian aid is that the volume of aid jumped quite a bit around 2004, 2005. So we're now sort of 14 years later, and we can see that there was generally an upward trend in volume, and that came along with India's growing economy and more resources there to engage with. And India started already in the 2007, 2008, engaging as far east as the Pacific Islands, including Fiji. So in terms of India's push east, or thinking further east, really this has been around a while, and while we sort of reconfigure and re-term what we're talking about, India's engagement in terms of aid was there from Africa to the Pacific Islands way before we really, this term has become fashionable. But what we have seen, I would say, is that as the volume increased, others became more interested to know what India's, how India is engaging in these countries. Indian foreign aid in terms of grants peaked in 2014-15 actually. Was $1.85 billion and has now come down to about $1 billion in this last fiscal year. But Indian aid is actually much more than that dollar figure. People, for comparability, usually focus on dollar to say, okay, well, it's only a fifth of Swedish aid. But really, that's not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at Indian aid in purchasing power parity terms, because $1 of Indian aid buys a heck of a lot more than $1 of American aid, for example, right? Because the technical staff, et cetera, are much more expensive in the US than here. And so when we convert Indian aid, say in 2016-17, it was 1.4 billion into purchasing power parity terms, that then becomes $5 billion. $5 billion compared to Australia, which in purchasing power parity terms in the same year gave 2.6. So half of what India gave in purchasing power parity terms. So the point I want to make there is that Indian aid and Indian engagement is actually much more significant than the looking at the dollar term would lead us to believe. Sweden, for example, in the same year gave $5 billion US dollars, but because of the high cost in Sweden, purchasing power parity terms, that only translates to 550 million US dollars, right? So about a tenth of what India gave in purchasing power parity terms in the same year. So that then leads countries to look at India in a whole different way, because they can get a lot more for the aid that they're being given. So what's happened in the last decade, not just under Modi, this really predates Modi, and it predates the Indo-Pacific concept being used more frequently the last couple of years, is that the diversity of countries, even though India engaged from the eastern shores of Africa to the Pacific Island countries, the diversity of the number of countries India engaged in and the kind of project in India engaged in has increased quite a bit. What's also happened is that there's been a shift over the past decade, past 15 years, from 20% going to the region to now 2/3 of Indian grants going to the region. So there's a greater focus on the region. When I mean the region, I'm talking about not only India's immediate neighborhood, but also including Southeast Asian countries. So the Indian Ocean region. Just quickly under Modi, because of the last years when we've started talking more about Indo-Pacific, and despite sort of the neighborhood first policy, we've actually seen a decrease in grants going to the region. When in 2013-14 it was about 94%, it's down to 81% in terms of grants. But what has happened under Modi is that India is increasingly looking at the China model, as China has been able to leverage these big loans where it can really give a lot for ports development, infrastructure development, and in particular under Modi there's been a focus on infrastructure. India has turned more to line of credits and recently also loans. So the line of credits, the Exim Bank, are going increasingly to the region and have increasingly an infrastructure focus. Okay, I'll just a couple more points there. I think what has happened the last few years, and particularly the recent political turnover in Maldives a few years ago in Sri Lanka, is that China has deeper pockets than India can match, right? And so going to line of credits and loans has been a way to try and bring more aid to the table. But the reality is, as we're seeing currently with the Maldives case, a country, as you all probably know, which is quite indebted, it's not clear how much, but perhaps as much as $3 billion to China, Indian foreign policy is really at a crossroad. It cannot quite match those kind of numbers. It cannot just give and grant $3 billion to Maldives, and yet in strategic terms, Maldives is really important to India. Same with Sri Lanka, etc. And I think this is, it's a time to really think about what Indo-Pacific really means in terms of leveraging. India has said they're going to give currency swaps, a loan to help with the Maldivian budget deficit, and perhaps even as much as $1 billion. Is that in India's interest? It might be a short stop, a gap measure, but longer term, I think this is the time to think strategically about what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. It's the time for countries to team up and to think about how does one ensure that the kind of debt for equity trade-offs that have happened in Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, that have happened in, from Australia to Djibouti and other places. There's talk in the Pacific Island countries of countries being so indebted that they might give ports and other infrastructure and land to China. I think it's a time where India needs to start discussing with other traditional and newer donors about how one could perhaps think more creatively about engagement in the Indo-Pacific. India has strategic interests that it wants to ensure. It does not want to have Chinese naval ships coming and docking at Hambantota, but how does one prevent that? At the same time, countries like Maldives have, turned towards India, but in the end, if the Sri Lankan example is anything to go by, there's only so much countries can do when they are in debt. Right? That debt will have to be paid off somehow. And is it really in India's interest to give money to Maldives so they can pay off China? So I think there's a larger issue. India has engaged much more through and has really used the Chinese model in terms of loans and lines of credit. But it's coming to a crossroad in terms of how much is it going to give in order to secure some of its strategic interests. Thanks.
Thank you, Rani. I think the Bandaid temptation, right, of bailing out neighboring countries is a very pressing issue in Delhi these days. We see it in the case of Matala Airport, a bad deal which Sri Lanka engaged in, a dead airport, which India is thinking of, at least with suggestions that it may bail Sri Lanka out of. Maldives is, of course, the most recent case, $200-300 million to pretty much pay off the Maldives debt. And note also, very important point you make, that we're not sure about the debt. The Maldivian government, President Akhtiyar, is saying we're assessing the debt, which says also a lot about the uncertainty, which is also a very dangerous precedent for India. And finally, I think the best form of denial is delivery. Right? The best form of denying China space is delivering better, more, and quicker. And that's a fundamental challenge for a country which spent 40 to 50 years closed, insulated from the rest of the region and other regions. And that's really the biggest strategic challenge probably in the neighborhood. So last but not least, Dr. C.Raja Mohan, I'm sure you don't have a slide, Raja, which is great because I'm sure you'll be able to wave all these threads together into a big picture of where this concept is taking it.
Thank you, Tino. Delighted to be here amidst so many friends and to make fresh acquaintance with so many others. Just let me begin with a word about ISAS, Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. That's where I've been for the last 6 months as the director of this institute. The institute has been around for almost 14 years. Essentially focused on studying contemporary South Asia, politics, economics, and security, as well as now beginning to look at the impact of technology on South Asia and how South Asia can leverage technology to transform its position. We're looking for deeper, stronger collaborations in Delhi, and we're delighted to partner with Brookings India. We hope we can create a much broader network for ISAS and Singapore here in India and beyond, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and other countries. Now, what I'm going to say, since I'm in Singapore, so I must say, look, I'm not speaking for anyone, and I've always been a minority in India, and it will be essentially a minority opinion that I'm going to say. First, I think I just want to make 4 sets of points. First is about definitions. I don't think we should, those of you who are practitioners here, may know that, look, definitions are useful only up to a point. You don't go beyond, too worried about, as political scientists, of course, have to put it in stone, so therefore they're always worried about definition, the concept. But practitioners have to deal with the messiness of the world as it is. And second, our diplomats are paid to, sometimes to clarify, sometimes to obfuscate, sometimes to mislead. That's part of the job, so we shouldn't take literally everything that the diplomats say in their speeches. So I think the word, so Indo-Pacific, how you define it, the Japanese have a definition, Indians have something else, the Americans have something else. But this goes on. But if you think of terrorism, for example, after 40 years of debate in the United Nations, we don't have a definition of terrorism. Has that stopped cooperation? No. So you know terrorism when you see it, right? When your plane gets hijacked, so you go by functional logic, and then you say, let's work together. So I think what you're going to see here is essentially people are going to articulate things for their own domestic opinion or their own national interests and views, but in the end is about actually a fundamental change that has taken place in the region. And I think that is far more consequential. The essence of what, when we say Indo-Pacific, that's far more consequential than what exactly we mean when we say Indo-Pacific. So what is the essence of Indo-Pacific? I think in essence it reflects, it describes the effects of rise of China on the structure of the geography and power in this part of the world, and the implications of emergence of India, not India's rise yet, India's emergence as another actor of consequence. So I think this dramatic advancement of China in the last 40 years and the slower emergence of India is going to fundamentally alter the geography of our region and of the world. So Indo-Pacific, in a sense, captures that basic idea. And I think there's nothing more than that. You know, no one is talking about a treaty. Of course, some of our Indonesian friends talk about a treaty. Someone else wants an institution. We're not into that. I mean, I think if you want to stick to what is operational, is essentially as a descriptor, the Indo-Pacific reflects the growing Chinese footprint in the Indian Ocean and India's growing interest in the Pacific, and more importantly, how to rebalance this region that has been unbalanced, if you will, by the rise of China. So can we structure a balance of power system? Of course, it's not the most favorite term. Most governments don't want to use it. But the fact is, in the end, that's where political science probably comes in. This is really about the rise of China has unbalanced the existing security institutions, whether it is the American alliances, whether it is the WTO, whether it is the nature of the regional institutions. So the rise of China, the single most important fact in our time, has tearing apart the existing structures. I'm not saying the Chinese are doing it deliberately, but the consequence of China's weight, a $12 trillion economy, 1 billion people, dramatic expansion of all material capabilities combined with a political will, and which rightly has a sense of wanting to be a great power. I don't think anyone can deny China that right to become a great power, much like the previous powers before it. But that rise has consequences. And the others are trying to respond to the consequences of China's rise. And I think much of the Indo-Pacific is really about dealing with the consequences of China's rise and how you deal with the China's rise. So it's really about finding answers to ensuring that China's rise does not completely, fundamentally destabilize this region, and how do you create a structure in which Chinese power can be accommodated. So, and the goals then, therefore, it's really about balancing China, not containing China, because you can't contain China, even if you want to, because China is too big to be contained. So this is about balancing China. And I think there should be no, you can tear away all the fluff around Indo-Pacific. In the end, this is about balancing China. Because China's rise has created a whole range of problems, political, economic, security, and international, how you deal with the consequences. That's really the essence. We are dealing with it. And that brings in India into this thing. So what are India's goals in now, as previous speakers have said? India has now sorted out, for the last 10 years, India was very worried about using the term Indo-Pacific, but now Prime Minister has put it down. So it's not part of the lexicon. But what are the objectives that India is trying to do, trying to achieve in this framework? One is clearly balancing China. You can say balancing China is India's karma. There's no escaping it, and it's not a new objective for India. The first treaties that Nehru signed, the treaties of security guarantees for Sikkim, it had some kind of status, we don't have to get into that, Sikkim, Bhutan and Nepal, 1949-50. The three treaties were signed as China was entering Tibet. So it's not that we've suddenly discovered wanting to balance China. I think when you have a large power next door, India was trying to balance China, 1949-50. 1971, people have forgotten, the Soviet treaty was as much about balancing China. It had less to do with balancing the United States, because China, Pakistan were aligning, and the need for India to avoid a two-front problem and to work with the Russians or the Soviets at that point of time. So it is part of India's tradition, and I think India's principal objective is to ensure a balance of China. Second, a multipolar Asia. Just as we often talk about multipolar world, it's the same time India wants a multipolar Asia in which China's rise can be accommodated and India's interests can be fully met. And within this, it's not just the US today we talk about. India would like to see more of Japan in the Indian Ocean. India would like to see more of Europe. We've seen it took us 15 years to negotiate LEMOA with the Americans. It took just 1 year to do it with the French. You know how the French are. Now, we will hopefully do it with Japan. We'll do it with other European countries, those who will. We would like to see Britain play a larger role in the Indian Ocean. Return to Indian Ocean, if you will, to return to east of Suez, if you will. That India needs every friend, every hand on the deck here to be able to create a structure of stability. So I would say the goals then are essentially balancing China through a quest for a multipolar Asia in partnership with large number of other powers, including the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, you name it, and the ASEAN countries. Now, if those are the goals, what are the means to achieve it? And I think now we begin to get into a bit of a trouble zone. So the first question, what are the means here is, how do we, when we say we want other powers here to partner us, how far do you go with the other powers? US, for example. Is it an alliance? Is it a strategic partnership? Major defense partner? You have so many names. India is supposed to be non-aligned. India doesn't do these things. So half the confusion is generated by this editorialists like us who keep writing. But the fact is that India has moved closer to the United States than it has ever been in the last 20 years, except barring 1959 to 62, where India did things with the Americans. Again, it was a China problem. Today, India's relationship with the US is a solid, more comprehensive partnership, but it is not going to be an alliance of the kind the US has with Japan, US has with Britain, or US has with other countries, but it is a partnership. So how we deal with it, it's not a question of India doesn't do these kind of things. It is the terms of that relationship. So there's no principle here involved, contrary to the public debate. It's not a question of principle. It is a question of all countries tries to maximize their freedom of action within an alliance or partnership while demanding the most from the other side. That's what alliances or partnerships are about, and I think India is going to do exactly the same. And I think its interests are to create this strong partnership with a large number of countries, and I think we'll see how that goes. And I think we've come a long way. This is often can be conflated, like you had the Prime Minister sitting with the Japanese and the American presidents, Japanese PM and the American president, calling it Jai, victory, success, whatever it is, and running to the meeting with the Chinese and the Russians. Of course, he didn't coin an abbreviation there. But the fact is that what we're doing with US and Japan, I mean, in some senses, is far more security, far more collaboration, while we try to keep our old friends Russians. We also try to keep because we also think, I think Russia has a role in the longer term to create a stable security order in the Indo-Pacific. How that gets played, I mean, there are a huge number of problems, but over the longer term, a Russian neutrality or a Russian positive approach to balance is critical. Right now, we're not there. But I think India would hope that you would get to a situation where Russia would play an important role. So if that is the goal, what are the problems here? I mean, I think that brings me to the real difficulties that India has, and much of the debate you see in public is an expression of those debates. So when somebody says, look, strategic autonomy, decisional autonomy, it's a constant thing of trying to tell the public, at least one lot of the public, we are not becoming a junior partner for the United States. But that has not stopped us from being a partner to the United States, nor does it prevent us from actually doing things, what we need to do with our friends in China and Russia, because while India needs the US to balance China, India does not want to provoke a near-term conflict with China. So therefore, how you manage the Chinese power, because the Chinese power differential with China has dramatically increased, and India has no intention or no interest or no desire to pick a quarrel when you're at this point of time. So you have to manage Chinese power, which is a reality, by partnerships, and then much of the challenge is how do you define the terms of that engagement with the other powers, what are the ways in which you can do it. The second challenge, I think, is on the economic side. My colleague Amit talked about it. India is not very user-friendly when it comes to trade. I mean, all of our partners know that, whether it is Bhutan or whether it is the United States. But the thing is, how much India can improve its way it thinks about trade and make it a more friendlier nation when it comes to giving market access, when it coming to working with other countries, that is going to be a huge challenge, and I think which we have to find a way to deal with it, and I think we've not really succeeded so far, because without that economic component, that India is not a valuable economic partner, your political construct is not going to be able to survive, and I think bringing the two in line is going to be a major challenge. The third is the military diplomacy that you saw Dhruva's chart. We've done quite a bit in the last 10 years, but still the structure of military cooperation is still very weak in India. Under the MOD, our ability, our defense industrial base is weak. Our ability to give military equipment assistance to other countries is limited in comparison to China. So therefore, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of military diplomacy and military support programs. And there, again, I think how we partner with the larger countries becomes a very important one. A fourth, I would say, challenge is really the weakness in project implementation. Some of the issues were raised. How do we undertake projects and make them, implement them in time so that you can effectively respond to what's happening. There, I think it's the volumes are not the question. It is the ability of India to deliver projects beyond its borders is a huge challenge, and I think we've seen some improvement in the last few years, but there is a huge amount of work to be done in the days ahead. So to sum up, then, I think whether you call it Indo-Pacific or not, whether we declare that our national objective is to balance China or not, the logic of balancing China is going to get more and more acute for India, because for the next 20 years or more, the imbalance between China and India beyond the region is going to grow. Because even if India does very well, grows at 10%, China grows only at 6%, we'll still be quite apart, and China will be quite above India. Therefore, balancing China through political, economic, and other means remains an important one. Second, we don't want to make sure, you want to have the capacity to take others with you. It can't be just we become an ally of the United States, that we need to raise our own independent profile. Because America will change its mind. We had the Canadians arrest Huawei chief. Yesterday, Trump tweeted saying, no, I can intervene in this case if the Chinese are willing to give me something. Now, so those of us who want to argue on legalistic terms, actually, Trump is telling you everything is political, but the important fact is the US and China are so interdependent. They will be under compulsion to find some accommodation. So at that point, we don't want to look like we're the ones gone too far out and then you backed up. But how we use the current situation to strengthen ourselves, to improve our position in this new geography is the big challenge. And within that, a whole range of activities India needs to do. I would certainly think last few years, we're doing more, but it's still work in progress. But the structure, the changing structure, the changing nature of geography, and the penetration of Chinese power into India's neighborhood would continue to demand that India take some way of balancing this Chinese power. How to do it without provoking China is the challenge for Indian strategy.
Thank you very much, Raja. I forgot to introduce you, but I think you don't need introduction because you're more than well known here, and it's a pleasure to have you here and have this closing presentation from you, from all the panelists, which I think puts everything in perspective. I think on the challenges in particular, two you mentioned. One is, of course, the human resources of playing diplomacy and doing diplomacy, right? With the Ministry of External Affairs being tremendously understaffed. And the second challenge in terms of material resources, the economic openness, as you mentioned also, which gives really India that weight of delivering and responding to expectations from its neighboring countries and beyond. So I will not take the chair's prerogative of asking questions. I think I've commented enough. So I'll open it up to the floor. The only two conditions is that you identify yourself, and the second one, that you ask a question. So please, sir.
I am Commodore Abhay from IDSA. And my question relates to the first slide of the chair, which the Shiv Shankar Menon's a reflection about Indo-Pacific being a ill-defined concept. And again, Dr. Raja Mohan reflected that definitions are not a problem. But my issue is that reflects certain strategic apprehension. My issue is what kind of definition, first of all, what are the apprehension? And two, what kind of definitional clarity would address those strategic concerns which are being expressed through the Shiv Shankar Menon articulation? Thank you.
We'll take a few questions together. Arno?
So my name is Arno Kirchhoff. I'm the head of the political department in the Embassy of Germany. Raja Mohan said India is not very friendly, it's not very user-friendly when it's coming down to trade. I don't know whether I would take it like that or not, but what I was puzzled about hearing all these presentations is, if trade is so important, one of the so important factors in the Indo-Pacific region, also from the geostrategic aspect of balancing China, or just for the sake of trade and economic development, why, and India is not user-friendly, to use your term, Raja, why does India not develop its own active trade policy on what India wants to achieve in trade in the region? What I observe after more than 2 years in India, that India is, when it's coming down to trade, is always reactive. So I'm really puzzled about why I can't see an active Indian trade strategy. Thank you.
Yes.
Bharat Joshi, CEO Jacob Ventures. My question is on the connectivity projects. So India has pretty much made its stand on joining the BRI clear. However, we do participate in the BCIM economic corridor, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, that connects Kunming to Kolkata, as you know. I wonder what the panel makes of this dichotomy. Thank you.
In the back, the lady, please.
I'm Arunama from Vision India Foundation. My question is, with India signing the Trans-Regional Maritime Network, how can we expect China to react to it? Because there'll be information sharing amongst 30 countries, of which China is also a partner. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, that's the first round. I think we'll reverse the order. Is that okay with you, Raja? We'll start with you, and then we'll give 2-3 minutes for each panelist, and we'll go for the second one.
Look, I think, I've said what I had to say on definitions, that, look, you can keep arguing, we have a Brahminical temptation, words are important for India. So half the time we're stuck on these definitional ideas rather than taking practical advantage of a situation. So as I said, the problem is not definition. The problem is Americans will change their position. Because today one of the principal problems is the domestic politics of both US and China. China a lot less visibly, but I think if Trump's trade war continues, there will be huge repercussions in Chinese domestic politics. So that's what is going to be your problem. Not today somebody gives you a clear definition. Are you going to do it? The key question, as I said, whether you call it Indo-Pacific, whether you call it continental, maritime, what we think China was a land continental problem, today it's a maritime challenge. So those challenges are coming to you. Question is, how do you address them? If somebody comes to you and says, look, I got this broader framework, you're not my treaty ally, but I'm willing to help you, that's what the Americans are saying. That's what the Japanese are saying, partner with us to create a structure. India is saying, yes, let's go. But India goes slowly, so that will go on, and meanwhile, The old guard in Delhi will say, look, don't do this, you'll get eaten up by the Americans. We've had the debate, on the nuclear debate, we had on the Lema work. So I think we're past that. As I said, look, leave the definition to political scientists. As a soldier, I think you should see, look, in the given context, what do I make best of the means that I have? That is the key question. Second, I think on the BCIM, look, nothing is happening. BCIM, the difference between BCIM and China-Pakistan corridor is there is no territorial dispute in BCIM. We're talking about something coming through Yunnan, through Burma, through Bangladesh to India. So there are no territorial issues, there's no sovereignty argument. But the rest of the arguments in terms of Chinese don't do enough consultations with the others, what are the terms on which the projects are going to be done, those are not being sorted out. So for a short while there was a track 1.5 negotiation, but that's not gone anywhere. At least at the current juncture, I don't see it going very far. Chinese reaction, look,
Sorry, sir. My question was, how do we participate in this? Why we choose to stay away from
No, who told you consistency is a virtue? You ask all these government guys sitting here, do they, it's not, again, I think don't take it Brahmanically, that it's not that this is a position, therefore we're going to do it everywhere the same thing. So we sit in, with the Chinese and AIIB. You can say that's a contradiction, but life is full of contradictions. The Chinese reaction to what India does, look, Chinese do their own thing. They're not waiting to find out what India thinks. They got a base in Djibouti. They've not asked India, what do you think about my getting a base in Djibouti? So Chinese say it's their right to be an Indian Ocean power. And they're going to do what they think is in their interest. Now, the question for India is, what does it do to secure its interests, its presumed sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean? How does it protect it in partnership with the others, to creating agreements which we never signed before? Does India seek its own bases? Of course, there's some talk about it. I don't know how far, how much. Can we share a base? Maybe someday Digo Garcia will share it with the Americans, presuming the Mauritians agree to it. So I think all kinds of things are possible. So it's a question of what is important is that how is India trying to cope with this rather than waiting to see what other people are going to react. But you calculate that. When you take a decision in international relations, no one is a complete free actor. You do something, the Chinese will respond in some way, and then you have to respond in some other way. That's why the system works. It's not that you have a free hand or the Chinese have a free hand. That's what I think it is. So,
Trade, Raja?
Trade, I think Abhijit is better position to talk about trade. But otherwise, the trade politics is a huge question.
But no, Raja, just strategically, is there thinking about trade and economics as a strategic imperative for India?
Look, I think the Foreign Office, the security guys can talk about a trade strategy, but you have to take your domestic industry with you. You have to take the poor farmers with you. The politicians will say, this won't get me votes. So if India's position on trade has long been one of protectionism, and last 25 years we have struggled bit by bit, some by stealth, some by openness to actually open up the economy. But we have been a laggard because I'm not saying it's criticizing it or saying it positively, but that's the structure. That's the nature of Indian politics. The question of how do you mobilize the poor people and the farmers, and how do you protect the industry, those are the ones that have limited I think in the end it's been self-defeating, but someone has to have the political will to alter the way this set of conjunctions of, that factors that operate, can you turn them in a way that they can support trade liberalization and to have more expansive outward orientation. But at this point, India still has one of the highest trade exposures. If we combine services and trade, commodity exports, it's close to $1 trillion plus in an economy of $2.7 trillion, and that's not a small amount.
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on our German colleague's comment with regard to trade and turn that also to look at aid, because I think you definitely have a valid point in terms of India being reactive. I'm sure my colleague Amitanda will say more on trade, but and I think India is at the crossroads. What is its strategy? When you talk to the Sri Lankans, they say, we actually approached India first and said, do you want to help us out with infrastructure, with Hambantota, etc.? And India said no, and so we went to the Chinese, and they were only too happy to give them money. The problem is that was not a financially viable project to start with. And it would require, India knew it required a lot of money. But now we're in a situation where India, sees that in Sri Lanka, the Chinese are developing 2 ports, both, with lease agreements that are substantial in terms of the number of years they're owned, majority Chinese owned and managed. And so, again, it's at a point of what does it do? China was one step ahead. It has ports all over the Indo-Pacific. But the problem is that India on its own can't do that, right? It does not have the pockets. What alternative is it going to offer Maldives, Sri Lanka? Well, certainly Pakistan is off the block. But I think it's time for people to, countries to come together and think strategically about what this imbalance will look like. What kind of alternatives can one offer countries that are heavily indebted to China to, in everybody's interest? I mean, it's not in India's interest to give money so they can, the Maldives and others can pay off the Chinese. And yet, then what? It's not in India's interest either to turn away and not help out Maldives, right? So it's really at a strategic crossroad, and it's time for India to sit down with some of its key partners and think about whether there are sort of larger alternatives that one can come up with beyond sort of the, little amounts that were being talked about on the US side and several other countries. It's time for something much bigger than that, I think.
And that's a process which has started in some ways, as you know, India, Japan, and third countries. The Asian Development Bank, which 10 years ago was not exactly welcome by India in this region, is now having a major impact in developing Southeast Asia connectivity for the next 10 years under their SASAC operational plan. Amitendo, up to you.
I really don't want to have the last word on trade, but let me just begin with one fact, and then I'll offer 3 explanations for your question. The fact is that if one looks at, purely the index of globalization for countries, external receipts and payments as a share of GDP, India is much ahead of the US and China. But if one looks at India purely in terms of an actor in global trade, India is small, which essentially means that India has not hesitated to globalize when it comes to the non-trade part of economic globalization. Essentially, in terms of financial transactions, capital account transactions, India is far, far ahead than most other economies. But it has hesitated on trade. Why? Let me offer 3 explanations. The first is, there has always been this view in India historically that the domestic economy is big enough, large enough to provide livelihoods, take care of it, provide the momentum, go ahead. If at all one looks at trade, let's look at it as a residual. Not as a primary factor, but as a residual factor. So as a result of it, it's not a question of India not having a proactive trade policy. India doesn't have a trade policy at all. Even a reactive trade policy is not a trade policy. It's just a reaction. Number 2 is that from the time India started thinking seriously about trade, which was essentially from the end of the Uruguay round of negotiations, late 80s, it came into the WTO. For a long time, it held on to the hope that the WTO will deliver. And the WTO is a forum where everybody is heard, and India was being heard more than necessary. But India came into the regional trade agreement game much, much later. And by the time it came in, the rules of the game were already set. It couldn't do much about that. It stayed well beyond that discourse. It didn't have anything to offer on the rules. Even today, on a subject like e-commerce, India doesn't have anything to offer because India doesn't want a discussion on e-commerce. So anything that India wants in that respect is just withdrawal and a protracted defense. And the final point is that for several constituencies in India, and this is just taking forward what Professor Raja Mohan mentioned, I'll put it much more bluntly. For most constituencies in India, exports are good, imports are bad. This is completely antithetical to trade because trade is a two-way game. But since that two-way game cannot be played so that one side can be maximized, you stay away from trade. And obviously after this there are questions of competitiveness. India is not competitive in most areas. It can become more competitive, but most of trade policy is actually domestic policy, which there has not been much attention paid to India about.
I'll just very quickly address three questions. One on the BCIM versus BRI. I have a slightly different explanation. These are, I think, the facts on the to put the facts on the table. One, BCIM predated BRI. India signed on to BCIM before BRI even existed in Xi Jinping's mind or whoever's mind, right? So I think BRI is seen as a political project, a unilateral Chinese political project, which is motivated by domestic politics and economics in China, and by strategic imperatives. The second thing is, I think India's objection to BRI is that should not be interpreted, as some have, including in India, as Indian opposition to infrastructure investment, as Indian opposition to Chinese investment. So just to give you some, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but Chinese investment into India now is roughly on the same scale as CPEC, if you take dollar value. I mean, I think it's a little less, but it's on, we're talking same ballpark figures, which I don't think a lot of people realize. I think that these contradictions are not exactly as contradictory as they are made out to seem, and in fact, playing up this fact as a contradiction is a narrative that suits China very well. So similarly, with India being part of AIIB and not part of BRI, one is a treaty-based organization in which India has voting shares. BRI is not that. On the Trans-Regional Maritime Network, I think there are two kinds of organizations, whether it's security, whether it's trade. One are big tents, where it's just nice to have a seat at the table, even if you agree about very little. RCEP might end up being one of these. It's a lowest common denominator trade agreement. SCO is another good example of this. And then you have organizations that have a much narrower agenda, narrower membership, more like-mindedness. AIIB is a good example of that, involving India and China and others. Similarly, India enters into a number of agreements, including bilateral and multilateral security arrangements as well. So the fact that it's a big tent, I think, should be seen for what it is. Finally, on the first question, look, I think we shouldn't get bogged. I would agree with Dr. Rajamohan. We shouldn't get bogged down in the literalism of the Indo-Pacific. And I'll just give you four arguments that I hear consistently in India against the idea of the Indo-Pacific. One, India is being dragged into other people's problems, right? I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, India takes a position on the South China Sea, for example, based on Indian interests. But the fact that India is using the term Indo-Pacific does not mean that India is somehow becoming, following the US's cue. I think if anything, and the sequence that I laid out suggests quite the opposite. Secondly, that Indo-Pacific invites China into the Indian Ocean. Now, I don't think China needs anyone's permission for that. China doesn't feel like it needs anyone's permission. China is here. That's a reality. The third criticism I hear often is that it cedes the land space. Again, I think that's a very literal interpretation. That the fact that we say Asia does not mean that we ignore the seas around Asia. So just because we use Indo-Pacific does not mean we should ignore what's happening on the continent. And finally, there's some criticism about the seam issue. Just because the different geographical definitions used by the US or India, I don't, that's a US bureaucratic problem. That's for them to sort out how CENTCOM and PACOM and AFRICOM work together. That shouldn't be India's problem. At best, India can try and work across those boundaries. So we will, I think, see a liaison in US Central Command, an Indian Navy officer in Bahrain. But beyond that, I mean, that's the US's operational problems. So, I mean, but these are the common criticisms that we hear and we continue to hear in India.
We started 9 minutes late, so and I've not seen a lot of attrition. So with the permission, I'll ask you 1 minute each at the end. Anything you want to comment or highlight? In particular, I mean, if we were sitting here 2008, 10 years ago, I think we all underestimated, at least, the impact, the consequences of Chinese rise. I think it's been a formidable development. I think everyone agrees with that, as Dr. Rajamohan was mentioning. Is there anything we're underestimating now in the Indo-Pacific? What do you think is the black swan which may derail a lot of India's efforts, or is there something we are not giving enough attention?
No, I think for most countries, the fundamental problem is how do you get a domestic consensus? we've seen in the US, we've seen in Japan, we've seen in India, everywhere, those with economic interests, given the interdependence with the United States, they've suggested, don't do this. We can't afford it. I mean, that's the Wall Street argument, the Goldman Sachs argument in the White House under Trump is, don't do this, it's bad for you. Well, there's another lot which is saying, we got to, if you don't take them on now, the US primacy will come under question. I think the same argument in Japan, same in India. A lot of people say, look, this is not going to work. We can't trust the Americans. Let's not do it. So I think it's not just one country. Across the board, unlike the Soviet Union, China is today the second largest economy, fully integrated into the political structures of the world. So the idea of a decoupling between US and China is going to be a torturous, long process with ups and downs. Similarly, to deal with the Chinese power and a military balance, constructing a military balance, is going to be equally daunting, and it could be a generation's work. So this is going to be a long process. So it's not, so we got to be prepared for, we must be prepared for significant changes in the existing alliances. South Korea, I don't know if there are any Koreans, I mean, is supposed to be an ally of the United States. If you see what the South Korean agenda vis-a-vis North is not the same as a large number of Americans think should be the agenda, what Japanese think should be the agenda. So I think the structure of Chinese power is going to bend, alter a whole lot of things. So constructing a coalition to limit that, to create a new balance, is going to be a work of a generation. And it has to be a patient, long-term effort to build a coalition. And I think that is the challenge, and not to worry too much about definitions of what the Americans are doing today or tomorrow. That for India, I think the challenge is, how does it strengthen its own material capabilities? How does it create those partnerships? How does it help its neighbors to be able to navigate this? That is a challenge. So I would say it's a long, patient struggle to produce that.
A long march.
You know, I would say that on India's foreign aid engagement, there is actually, surprisingly perhaps, quite a bit of consensus that India should be engaging, and that it's a good thing that it has started engaging more with Afghanistan, for example, post-2001. So I think that the direction is clear, but the capability of providing what's needed today, right, with situations such as Maldives, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Myanmar, we can go on, in the Indo-Pacific, is something that is a huge challenge, and India can't do it alone. I think it's clearly time to think about innovative ways of partnering with European countries, with the US, to come up with a larger architecture, a way of engaging that is not only in India's interest, but is in the interest of many countries, including the countries that are recipients of foreign aid, Indian foreign aid.
Thank you, Rani.
I think I'll point to the trade war. I'll point to the trade war for the simple reason that this is something which is not going to go away. And it's not a question of tariffs being stopped or taken off, because it's a fight to the finish. It's a fight for controlling the future industries. India cannot afford to disengage with China when it comes to an economic sphere of engagement. The problem is that the trade war is being driven from geopolitical objectives. And let me give you a very small example. The United States, Mexico and Canada changed NAFTA. There is a condition in Section 32 of NAFTA that Canada and Mexico cannot enter into a free trade agreement with, quote unquote, any non-market economy. The reference is obvious. Now, what this means is, in future, if other countries in the Indo-Pacific start picking up this phrase or equivalent phrases or identical phrases for choosing their trade partners or keeping their partners away from other partners, it actually becomes an extremely complicated game for a country like India. It doesn't know where to go. In the first place, it didn't know how all this started, because I think whether India came into this game at all out of its own volition is a different issue. But today it faces a series of developments which are completely outside its control. And that really doesn't do much for its own future long-term policies. So we can conveniently forget about an active trade policy. I think it's going to be a survival policy.
That's a very big black swan indeed, I think, for India.
So I have a bigger worry, which is I think India will be able to survive a large number of black swans that survived over the past 50 years, very significant ones, very significant changes. I think if you look at 1991, where you had a balance of payments crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union, flaring insurgency in J&K, I mean, you had a number of things hit India at the same time in the early 90s, and India got through terrorism, international terrorism. India got through that okay. Arguably got through that better off. What would keep me up at night is actually India's inability. It's not actually a means issue, and it's not a conceptual issue, which is I think the two things we focus on a lot. It's actually a process issue, and it's basically that India's bureaucratic structures are not well equipped to translate the means, which are now there and growing, to meet the conceptual objectives that we have discussed here today. And I'll give you just 6 areas that I would like to see in an ideal world fixed, and I'm pessimistic about these being fixed. One is coordination between the foreign and defense establishments. We don't have a defense policy, we don't have a sizable defense policy shop. We have a 1JS pick for policy and international cooperation. That's not enough given India's needs that I outlined, and India's current activities. That's not adequate to meet those standards. The second is between the finance, I think the least strategic element of India is the finance ministry, which unfortunately is sitting on the money and is therefore very important. And so when it comes to aid delivery, a big problem India faces is that there are gaps, sometimes even within 1 year, because the financing has not been approved by the finance ministry. So getting that coordination between the finance ministry and other agencies, I think is going to be a second big challenge. 3, between trade, I'm not going to elaborate upon this, but between the trade and the strategic elements. India is perhaps one of the few major economies today that has a commerce and industry ministry, where the commerce minister is effectively, and the commerce secretary are the chief trade negotiators. You don't have an independent US trade representative type model, nor do you have a DFAT Australian foreign and trade office, or Sweden or many other countries have. So we don't have so oftentimes in trade negotiations, you come in at a disadvantage, and you're also representing a domestic constituency. 4 is between Indian aid and others, and I think Rani elaborated upon this in some detail. I think we may see some movement on that, positive movement on the next 6 months to a year. 5, between the defense establishment and industry. The biggest, and we're still operating in this mode of technology denials, as if the entire country is ganging up against us and is trying to deny us technology. That is no longer the case. India is very uniquely positioned in that it, on paper, has access to really advanced technology from the US, from Russia, from France, and from many others. But India's ability to take advantage of that is hindered by some of these bureaucratic issues and a lack of coordination with industry. Finally, amongst the services, we still have a lot of bureaucratic infighting amongst the services. The naval budget is, Admiral Anup Singh is here, 17%, I think, roughly, which is inadequate to meet the challenges that we've outlined here. So I think unless these bureaucratic tussles can be resolved in some way, and maybe they will around the margins, I'm pessimistic about large-scale reforms. If this can be done, I'm quite optimistic India can see off black swans.
Excellent. So coordination being the key. Before we part ways, two notes. First, to thank Dr. C.Raja Mohan, Dr. Rani Mullen, and Dr. Amit Indopal for joining us here, and ISIS for partnering with us. We hope to take this collaboration further and take it into new, interesting research projects on, looking at these questions of what's actually driving India's Indo-Pacific approach and how to improve in many ways on these many problems we identified here today and take into a more optimistic light. And second, to thank all of you for joining us here. Please do come back to Brookings India for our future events in 2019. Thank you.